All right, can everyone hear me? We're going to go ahead and get started. Yep. Well, good morning, or depending on your location. My name is Audrey Mossberger, and I'm Director of Events at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, China's Vision for a New World Order in Theory and Practice. This discussion accompanies the findings of NBR's two-year-long project, China's Vision for a New Regional and Global Order. Before turning it over to NBR President Roy Camphausen, I'd like to highlight 2 quick points to ensure a smooth experience for everyone. First, to change your screen view, you can navigate to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and toggle between the various options. We recommend active speaker view for this discussion, as each panelist will be pinned during their respective remarks. Following remarks by our expert panel, we'll open it up to audience Q&A. To submit a question, we kindly ask that you utilize the WebEx chat box, the icon for which can be found in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and resembles a small speech bubble. Clicking on the icon will open the chat box on the right side of your screen. To ask a question, simply select everyone from the drop-down box, type your question, and hit enter. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the event, even prior to Q&A. You might find that your question is addressed during the discussion. If not, our moderator will do his best to present all questions to the panel within our allotted time. For those joining us via live stream, we encourage you to email any questions to events@nbr.org. We look forward to an engaging and interactive exchange with our expert panel. And with that, I will turn it over to Roy. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey, and good day to all of you in whatever time zone you find yourself. I'm Roy Camphausen, President of NBR. As Audrey noted, today marks the concluding event of NBR's 2-year project, China's Vision for a New Regional and Global Order. This project, generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and led by NBR Senior Fellow Nadège Roland, assesses China's vision for a new regional and global order and examines how this vision is taking shape in practice. In the first phase of the project, NBR published a major special report, China's Vision for a New World Order, authored by Nadège. A central finding of that report is that China is striving to shape the world order to better reflect and respect its values and interests, even as it rises and seeks a more central position on the global stage. Nadège examined how China's elites envision this new global order by using an inside-out approach based on careful examination of Chinese language sources and government documents. The report argues that Beijing seeks a, quote, loose, partial, and malleable hegemony exercised primarily in the global south. In this emerging illiberal subsystem, China would be the dominant power. In the second phase of the project, NBR has just published another major report titled An Emerging China-Centric Order, China's Vision for a New World Order in Practice. Again, led by Nadège, this multi-author report examines the extent to which a new Sinocentric global subsystem may already be forming by way of examining 7 individual case studies. The case studies consist of 2 countries, 2 international systems, 2 international norms, and 1 functional domain. And the report discerns that although the creation of a Sinocentric order is still very much in an early stage, elements of the order have already begun to materialize. Our panel today will discuss findings from this second report. Before I turn the floor over to my colleague, Michael Wills, who will moderate the panel, I'd like to thank the invaluable members of our project team who brought this work and the entire project together. First, thanks so much to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, as they were the generous funder for this project, crucial in supporting all research and project activities with generosity and patience. Of course, I'd like to thank Nadège Roland, my colleague, for her diligent work and untiring commitment to leading this project as principal investigator. Also like to thank the senior advisors for the project, Professor Harry Harding, Professor Jennifer Lind, and Professor Andy Nathan, as they were assisted in directing and reviewing the research efforts, especially for the multi-author report. Next, I'd like to thank the 7 authors who contributed to the second phase's China Vision for a New World Order in Practice publication. 2 of them are on the panel, and we'll hear more about the others during that discussion. And lastly, importantly, I'd like to thank my colleagues at NBR for putting this event together. From Audrey, Nadej, who led the project, our Vice President of Research, Ali Sawinski, and of course, Rachel Bernstein for her careful management of the project and role in ensuring the project's success. Thank you all very much. And now, Michael, I turn it over to you for our panel.
Thank you, Roy, and welcome everybody to today's discussion. We have three contributors to the report here with us on the event today, and I'm going to introduce them all briefly now and then turn to each of them and have them make a few minutes of remarks based on their work for the project before we open up for a Q&A. Given the number of people taking part in the event today, as Audrey mentioned, please send your questions through the chat function in WebEx or through email if you're watching online, and then the staff will feed those to me and I will feed them in turn back to the panelists. Our first presentation today is from Nadej Roland, colleague of mine here at NBR, the principal investigator and an editor of this most recent study of China's World Vision. Previously, she also did a seminal study for us here at NBR on the Belt and Road Initiative, which was published in 2017. And she's contributed also to our Strategic Asia program. Prior to joining NBR as a senior fellow for political and security affairs, Nadej was a senior analyst in the French Ministry of Defense focused on China and Asia. And she really has deep expertise in what the Chinese political and security establishment is trying to achieve and how it thinks about the world. Following Nadej's remarks, we'll turn to Adam Siegel. Adam, it's good to see you again. It's been a number of years since we last worked together. Adam holds the Ira Lippman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also directs the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program there, and he's one of the contributors to the study that we're releasing now. And our third and final speaker this morning will be Andrea Warden, who is a lecturer and the William Wrench Practitioner Instructor in the Program for East Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and also a non-resident research fellow at Synopsys. And she's worked widely on China and human rights issues, and her chapter in this particular report focuses on China's human rights work at the UN. So we've asked each of our speakers to make 5 or 6 minutes of remarks to sort of summarize their key findings, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Nadej, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Roy, for this very kind introduction as well, and for our audience for being here with us today for this launch. It's a joyful event. It's also a bit sad to see the wrap up of this project that has taken us for the last 2 years in the inner works of the discussions of this vision for a new world order, both in theory and in practice as well. In many ways, Xi Jinping has provided some unprecedented level of clarity about the Chinese leadership's aspirations and ambitions. But on the other hand, there are still areas that are still gray and obscure and opaque. And one of them is, what is it that China wants for itself in the world? And there's more discussion about China's dissatisfaction with the current system, with the current world order, but not so much beyond official ambiguous formulations such as the creation of a community of shared future for humankind. Of what is it exactly? What kind of system, what kind of mechanisms, rules, institutions even that China would want to create to offer in order to shape this system in ways that it would prefer. And so this is the main question that was behind this project. Can we try to see from the internal discussions that are occurring around the political circles, because that core circle, the political elites, is difficult to penetrate from the outside. But there's a very fruitful discussion among scholars and intellectuals that the party state itself has encouraged to think about these issues, this topic in particular. And there's a wealth of material that we can try to probe, to analyze, to examine, in order to find maybe some clues about what kind of world would China want to create at its own hands. And so what we have found, first of all, is that those discussions are really important, and there's a true effort that's being made to think about this issue, which in itself I think is a great insight. There are lots of explorations of different forms of, let's say, leadership. The Chinese elites don't really like the word hegemony when it's related to China itself. But what's interesting too is that as those intellectuals in China are thinking about a new world order under China's helm, they seem to reject Western models, but instead tend to turn back to China's own past experiences and get some inspiration from ancient systems of Tianxia, everything under heavens, and tributary system, which was the more traditional way of conducting international relations when China was the dominant power in East Asia for centuries. Beyond these, so there's a variety of views, obviously. Not everyone thinks about the same way, but this is a sort of a common point that those researchers are looking at. This doesn't mean, however, that the world order envision is what the Tianxia or tribute system was about. It's not based on Confucian values. It's a strange idiosyncratic mix, really, of this overarching organization for the world, but underpinned by Leninism more than it is by Confucianism. So this seems to be a little bit of a weird mix if you want to reorganize the world this way. And how is it that this is going to work exactly? This is a puzzle that we have tried to discover, to uncover with this project and those two reports. Sometimes discussions about China are about China wanting to take over the world or overthrowing the international system. What we have found is that this is not as simplistic as that. And this is why this formulation of a partial, loose, and malleable form of hegemony is important, in the sense that it brings us to trying to understand China on its own terms rather than applying our own concepts or systems into what they want. I'm going to stop now so that I can give the floor to two of our authors in the second of that second report that we just published. What I have focused on was more on the theoretical side, and what I have asked those 7 authors in their particular studies, case studies, was to give us some samples of China's diplomatic practice, so that we could try to judge or examine whether these theoretical discussions were already starting to appear, or the features and characteristics that we had uncovered in those theoretical discussions were already starting to appear in reality. And their chapters all put together will show you that there's a lot of things that are already discernible in the way that China is acting and progressing in the world. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Nadège. As you noted, the report looks at a series of case studies geographically and functionally. We'll turn to a functional one now, and I'd like Adam to speak for a few minutes about the work that he did on the application of China's vision for a new world order in the domain of cyberspace.
Thanks very much, Michael. Nice to see you again. And thanks to NBR for including me in the project, and Nadège in particular for her stewardship and all her direction for all the chapters. It was really a great pleasure to be part of this. So as Michael said, I'm going to talk about Chinese views of cyber, and in particular the idea of cyberspace. I'll talk a little bit about the tools they're using to achieve its goals in cyberspace. And then I'll just conclude with the kind of paradoxical finding that although I think the idea of cyber sovereignty is gaining traction in international circles and among numbers of nation states, I don't think it has a lot to do with Chinese diplomacy and Chinese efforts. I think mainly it's a reflection about disenchantment with the internet that's felt in lots of nation states. And as a result, I think we're seeing a kind of change in messaging on the Chinese side, less focused on cyber sovereignty or on ideas like building a community of shared destiny in cyberspace, although the goals are still the same. So what is it that we've seen happening in particular, as Nadège mentioned, is that under Xi, a much more assertive view, and in particular, a reactive and defensive view of what China was doing in cyberspace to much broader efforts to shape global cyberspace. And it's important to Chinese leaders for three particular reasons. One is, of course, to control the flow of information and to ensure domestic stability and regime legitimacy, and the continued role of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And the decision was basically made that the integrity of the firewall could not be assured just by technological upgrading and regulatory evolution at home. You also had to shape the international environment. Second, there's a strong component of technological autarky and independence that expresses itself in cyber sovereignty. So a desire not to be dependent on the West for critical and core technology. And third, really to shape cyberspace to extend Beijing's military, political, economic influence and counter the advantages that Beijing saw flowing to Washington the last 20 years. If we realize that the internet is an American invention and the expansion really to a global platform came through American technology and American companies, and the operating system was very much American, with American assumptions about privacy, innovation, and the role of the private sector. China really wants to shape that so the advantages flow to Beijing and not to Washington. The clearest elucidation of cyber sovereignty came in a speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2015 at the Wujian conference, and then is kind of recreated in the 2017 International Strategy for Cyberspace that came out of the Foreign Ministry. And it essentially has three main components. One is that all countries should respect the other country's right to choose their own path in cyber development and models of cyber regulation. So no criticism of the Great Firewall. Everyone should participate in equal footing in governance. And third, countries shouldn't pursue cyber hegemony or interference in other countries' internal affairs on cyber issues. China's cyber sovereignty efforts has two components: a domestic and an international. On the domestic side, what we've really seen is of a massive expansion and new laws on content regulation, but also the cybersecurity law, the personal information security specifications, the MLPS, And this both is to give China the domestic capability side, but also provides an alternative to European and US efforts to regulate the collection, storage, and transfer of data. And also, China has been training visiting delegations in the Chinese model of internet regulation. On the international side, we see a lot of discussion about the concepts of cyber sovereignty through the UN, in particular China's interventions at the group of government expert and the open-ended working group, which is discussing norms and rules of the road for state behavior. It doesn't come up so much in Belt and Road Initiative, but of course, Chinese tech firms, as they expand along the digital Silk Road, help states that are looking to control the internet and adopt a more Chinese version, gives them the technological capabilities and the regulatory models that they can move there. As Nadej says, I think cyberspace really fits the model that she described in her first study, that this is really, the Chinese don't believe they're going to convert everyone to this view. It is one that will be partial, loose, and malleable. It'll be primarily focused on the developing world, countries that are expanding their presence in cyberspace, but is not going to have that much of effect in the like-minded, liberal-minded countries about how they move there. Just to conclude, I think what we've seen is a change in messaging. So China has not been using cyber sovereignty that much, as much as it used to. Has shifted more, I think, to this idea about shared destiny in cyberspace. I think one that's done to contrast what the kind of the messaging come out of the Trump administration. And second, as I said at the beginning, is I don't think they have to do that. I think there's been such widespread discontentment with the model of kind of an unregulated internet. We see almost every state trying to struggle with how do you control content, how do you make sure supply chains are safe, that they are adopting many tools that look like cyber sovereignty. And so China can pretty much doesn't have to promote those views because they're being adopted so widely by others on their own. I will stop there, Michael, and turn it over to Andrea.
Great, thank you, Adam. Andrea, let's pick up on Adam's note about the UN there and come over to your chapter to the study here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Do I need to unmute?
You're good, Andrea.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So first, I would thank Nadej and NBR. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I really appreciate the invitation to participate in this important and really interesting project. The Human Rights Council is indeed a critical venue for examining the new world order that the CCP envisions and that it is actually in the process of creating. The PRC has made significant strides during the past few years towards achieving its objectives at the Council. Xi Jinping's speech in Geneva in January 2017, which came just after his speech at Davos, triggered a flurry of activity among Chinese diplomats in Geneva. It was as if to say, now we have arrived. We will be setting and we will be setting the agenda. And that agenda involves shaping the world into a China-led community of shared future for humankind. And this world will feature China's norms, values, and discourse. The withdrawal of the United States from the Council in June 2018 created even more space for China to take center stage and work towards dictating a direction for the Council that better aligns with China's interests. I'll focus on 3 main points today. First, China has the influence and votes to push forward its illiberal human rights agenda at the Council. Because of the mandated equitable geographic distribution of the 47 Council members, China is almost certain to secure enough votes to achieve its objectives. Not always, but most of the time. as the self-anointed leader and speaker on behalf of developing countries in the global south, many of whom are Belt and Road Initiative partners, China wields a great deal of influence. Economic coercion, threats, inducements, mutual interests all play a role here. In addition, the authoritarian governments in the quote-unquote like-minded group, the LMG, at the UN, of course, generally share China's interests at the Council, and that is to avoid scrutiny and criticism and weaken civil and political rights. The CCP's agenda at the Council, of course, has nothing to do with protecting and promoting individual human rights and freedoms or enabling civil society, and as such undermines the mandate of the Council and the international human rights system as a whole. The CCP rejects what it refers to as so-called universal values, both at home, as we have seen clearly in document number 9 from 2013, and in Geneva, where it actively seeks to dilute and undermine the key principles of international human rights law, including the universality and interdependence and indivisibility of all human rights. The Chinese party state places the right to development above all else and positions it as a necessary precondition for all other rights. China has also been behind a dramatic uptick in activity involving the right to development at the Council in the past few years. Second, the sudden burst of activity that started in early 2017 reveals an apparent long-term strategy that is now unfolding. Most notably, the PRC has begun to regularly issue its own resolutions on topics that reflect its interests and often include CCP phrases and concepts like building a community of shared future for humankind. It has introduced resolutions on the contribution of development to the enjoyment of all human rights, and 2 different resolutions on its signature feel-good and very vague win-win cooperation or mutually beneficial cooperation. And now, currently before the HRC, which is in session, a resolution co-sponsored with Pakistan titled Putting People at the Center of Efforts in Promoting and Protecting Human Rights. It's all an Orwellian wordfuck, which individuals as rights holders whose rights states are obligated to protect are nowhere to be found. China's resolutions are adopted even when votes are called because China has the votes. These successes then get reported back home via state media and other channels, conveying a legitimizing message along the lines of, see, the international community agrees with the CCP's approach to human rights and recognize China as a leader in global human rights governance. Thus, through its actions at the Human Rights Council, we can see what the CCP envisions for a China-centric world order in terms of norms and values. It's an authoritarian's utopia anchored on the right to development, mutually beneficial cooperation, whatever that means, mutual respect, dialogue, consultation, and it's a world where rights belong to states, collective interests are all that matter, and there is no criticism or dissent. Third, and my third and final point, in what could be called the grand alignment, the PRC has successfully pushed for a recognition at the UN of the purported alignment and synergies between the BRI and the UN's Human Rights-Based 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which features the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which all countries have signed on to and are supposed to complete by 2030. And also, as part of this grand alignment is indeed, of course, the CCP's ultimate goal of building a community of shared future. The right to development is described as both a driver of and the expected result of this grand alignment. It is a key through line that links the Human Rights Council with the Sustainable Development and Economic Affairs departments in New York. So it provides a bridge between Geneva and New York. And those entities in New York, China has substantial influence over. In sum, China has been able to embed its key foreign policy strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative, into the 2030 agenda and use the right to development, which is taking up a lot of bandwidth, to weaken the protection and promotion of other rights, both in Geneva and New York. The BRI now is packaged as a vehicle for the delivery of human rights, upon which the Sustainable Development Goals are based. This notion has already made at least a few appearances and talking points and documents at the Council that I'm aware of. I imagine we'll see much more of this soon, all in the service of a China-led community of shared future. So I'll stop there. look forward to questions.
Thank you, Andrea. Some questions are coming in. I'm going to prerogative of the moderator's chair. Nadej, for you, I'd like you to pick up on comments that both Adam and Andrea have made about the connection between BRI and China's vision of a new world order. I mean, I know you've worked on both with NBR, so I'd like to hear you spend a couple minutes explaining the connection between these two initiatives from Beijing. And then Adam and Andrea, similar question for each of you. Essentially what you're describing is a contestation of norms or ideas. Adam, in your case, about how to govern cyberspace and the internet. Andrea, in your case, the sort of universality of human rights. And so what I'm curious about for both you, Adam and Andrea, how well is the West at the moment sort of protecting its corner and promoting its vision of in our case, a free and open internet? Andrea, Adam, in your case, Andrea, you know, the protection of norms of sort of liberal democratic rule of law norms at the UN. I'm just curious, as you've worked on this project and you've sort of explored what China's trying to do in these areas, how do you conclude the effectiveness of Western responses to those?
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Yes, the link between BRI and China's vision for a world order is very interesting. You know, it's like it's a non-ending loop between one and the other. When I started my research on Belt and Road in 2014, it led me to understand this project as a grand strategy for China to achieve this Sinocentric order, basically creating new trade connectivities, financial security, etc., to call up this new world order that would be led by China. So then the perspective that we took in this project was the reverse. And starting from those theoretical discussions about what kind of a world order would emerge, what would be Chinese preferences about that, and then throughout those discussions, then you discover that BRI has a central role in the way as an instrument to help this new organization of the world emerge. So it's a central backbone in a way to this vision. On the one hand, the vision is quite abstract. On the other hand, Belt and Road is supposed to be the more concrete ways in which China wants to achieve this vision. So it's a major instrument in attaining this goal.
Thank you. Let's go to you next for the cyberspace reaction.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and the last 2 weeks around the debate about TikTok is kind of symbolic, I think, of the answer I'm going to give. I think the problem is the West or the US and the like-minded right now are struggling themselves to define what it is we want in this space. Yes, we still talk about a free, open, and global internet, but the debates that are happening in the US about reforming Section 230 of the communications law that would take away some intermediary liability protections for content providers, the desire in Europe and other places talking about digital sovereignty and reducing the dependence on US cloud providers, the Clean Network Initiative that came out of the State Department has a lot of components that are based on security, not on censorship reasons, that look like cyber sovereignty. So even though there are, I think, arguments to be made about why what the US and its like-minded are talking about is different from cyber sovereignty, it's private sector actors, there's a rule of law in place, there's transparency and accountability. I think if you're one of the states that's looking for a model of internet management, those distinctions are probably going to be lost. And so I think one of the reasons why the US has had a difficult time pushing back is because it's undermined its own message at home.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yes. Oh. Hi. Yes. So the liberal democracies, or the like-mindeds, if you will, are doing their best in under very difficult circumstances. The U.S.'s withdrawal of the from the Human Rights Council, as I mentioned earlier, has not helped matters. China is really taking up a tremendous amount of space and bandwidth at the Human Rights Council, exerting its influence in every nook and cranny. So, but we are outnumbered, no doubt about it. One sort of bright note is that if we take a look at the votes for China's two resolutions on mutually beneficial cooperation, the first one in March 2018, and the second one June 2020. The first, and these resolutions, China is very much trying to redefine human rights, upend priorities, and insert its language, its vision into Human Rights Council resolutions. Only one country voted against China's March 2018 resolution, and that was the United States. Before we withdrew from the council, the like-mindeds basically abstained. But in the June 2020 contest, if you will, there were 16 votes against and quite a few abstentions. So China is facing more pushback now, which is great. And in terms of its sort of anti-human rights agenda, and I think that also another sort of bright note is that the special procedures for the independent experts, there were 50 of them who in June issued a call for heightened scrutiny of China's human rights record. This was unprecedented to have this 50+ person joint statement with a call for a monitoring mechanism on China's human rights abuses. I think the crisis in Xinjiang, as well as Tibet, and of course Hong Kong and the new national security law, all of these things I think may well have sort of played a kind of a tipping kind of function in sort of alerting, or sort of I think that the special procedures at the Human Rights Council felt like we have to do something. We have to do something to check China's conduct and human rights violations. So that's very, very encouraging. One final point that I wanted to make on this score is that so as I mentioned earlier, China professes to speak for the global South and to say, oh, our human rights vision is one that resonates in the global South, and that is every country has the right to choose its own human rights path. We don't really subscribe to universality. It's a very relativistic view of human rights. But in response to this joint statement by the 50 independent experts at the UN, more than 300 NGOs basically came together to issue a joint letter in support of the call for a special monitoring mechanism at the UN on China. And of those 300 NGOs, 52 of them are based on the African continent. So I thought that was also encouraging. So the sort of the global South, China cannot purport to speak for the global South in its entirety. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let me pick up on that global South element a little bit and come back to Nadej for a question. I'd like you to unpack a little bit more this concept of partial, limited, malleable hegemony. We're getting some questions in that the traditional IR theory would suggest that China, as a rising great power, would try to exercise hegemony in its own neighborhood. If you could explain for us a little bit more about the conclusions you reached in the first part of the study. And then as a second element of the question, Nadej, You described how some of these traditional Chinese concepts of the tributary system in terms of governing international relations, Tianxia and Confucian sort of underpinnings, but you also talked about Leninism. We often talk about Leninism, Marxism, Mao Zedong thought. Now it's, what is it, Chinese socialism with Xi Jinping thought, or I don't forget the current formulation, but explain to us how two very conflicting worldviews, a traditional Chinese worldview from thousands of years ago, plus a much more modern, Western-inspired Marxist view of the world. How are those things meshing together? And is there an incoherence there that China's kind of grappling with as it develops its vision for a new order?
These are very complex questions, and that's why we spent 2 years grappling with them and have a full 300 pages reports on these. I'll try to be brief. This concept of, the formulation I came up with was the best I could do. I wish I could have found something that was more pithy in a way, but it stems from, again, all those discussions, internal discussions, and so partial as compared or as opposed with global. I don't think for now that in the current discussions and debates around this topic, there is no visible desire to assert China's global domination now, or as of yet. It's more partial, and it's not like it wants to overthrow everything that currently exists, that the full international system, and destroy everything and rebuild something new. It's actually trying to erode parts of it, and you could hear from both Adam and Andrea that in the normative part, it's started already to try to erode those values and norms that were present before. It's partial, not global, but it's not regional either, or not entirely regional either. What I mean here is that the way the discussions are presenting this would not be just fixated or focused on East Asia only, not just on China's immediate neighborhood. That is part of it, certainly, but it goes beyond that. It goes through regions, as we discussed, mostly in the developing world, what is called the Global South, because these are areas where I think Beijing feels that its influence can be greater than in Western liberal democracies. If you want to assert your influence, you need to find areas and places and countries where your own worldview, your own vision would be accepted more easily. And therefore, this is where the overlap between this vision and BRI is so important, because BRI gives us a sort of mental map of where Beijing would want to assert its influence in a greater, in a more important, more assertive way. And that brings me to this idea of the tributary system. Of course, I don't think that what Beijing wants today is a formal reincarnation of the tributary system of the old ages. It's not really possible to do that. But in a sense, the tributary system had a certain list of characteristics that Beijing would still want to see appear. So first of all, it's hierarchical and asymmetrical. China is the biggest power, the strongest, the most powerful one, and the others are smaller, weaker powers orbiting around China. The control is not direct. It's not a control necessarily through conquest or through military occupation or through changes in government, or putting Chinese governors to rule these countries or areas. That's why it's loose. It's a loose form of control that is more obtained through this asymmetry of power and the interdependency that is created between China's own economic clout and those smaller countries. That to me was an interesting translation into the 21st century of those interactions of the Chinese Empire with its vassal states. It was exactly that. It was creating those dependencies in the shadow of China's economic and military domination. And what was important here was that the domination was not necessarily imposed directly, but imposed through this network of dependencies. The vassal states used to kowtow to Beijing because they also felt like they had some benefit out of this relationship. They were able to trade with China, a little bit like many countries now want to trade with China and to have access to its market. It's remarkable that the similarity still plays on today. They wanted to there was a level of legitimization of their own power. The kings of those entities wanted to be approved by the emperor. Now the legitimization is mostly indirect through, and especially for autocratic or authoritarian countries that can turn to China in a way that helps them not being isolated from the rest of the international community. We have a chapter on Cambodia in our report written by Chris Horton that really examines all the intricacies of those dependencies, including the legitimization of Hun Sen's regime. That is very interesting. It really resonates with the ancient way of the tribute system. So yes, it sounds a bit odd that it's like in French we say it's the marriage between a carp and a rabbit, which is odd, right? Ancient tribute system and Leninism, how is that working? I think that in that sense, the Tianxia or tribute system gives you the sort of strategic level, the overall architecture again, in hierarchy, asymmetry of power, loose form of control. And the Leninism gives you the tactics. It's part of almost a philosophy of how do you do diplomacy. And here, one of the core elements of that is the United Front system, which is unique to China and is providing a whole array of non-official or parallel parallel diplomacy that China can use to continue to develop its influence in those countries. And to finish, I think that both the Tianxia and the Leninism have in common this idea of power, of Chinese power, and that kind of domination as well. There's a sort of ruthlessness about that, but that's why also the official rhetoric cannot really say that this is what they want, because in a system that favors sovereign equality, you cannot tell the rest of the world that what you want is this hierarchical order where you are the greatest, most powerful power, and others cannot really. Their room for maneuver is really limited in that case.
So, Adam, I'd like to come to you with a question relating to something that Des just said there. If this is fundamentally about power, playing out what you were saying earlier, if we're moving from a world of a sort of single internet to a more managed internet that China dominates, and we're not quite sure where the Western version's going, especially given some of the tensions between, say, US visions of how we govern internet and data and European ones, which are moving in different directions. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit too. But is China going to be comfortable with a world where maybe there are sort of two more loosely related internet systems in place? Will the Western one, if it remains open and views can be freely expressed, does that remain a threat to China as it's trying to implement this vision of the world? I'm going to give you just a minute or two to think about that, because I have a similar question to Andrea. Andrea, Nadej mentioned sort of this idea of power and states within China's new orbit having to behave in a certain way. And one of the examples you mentioned a little while ago, though, was this sort of pushback within the human rights body of the UN and these NGOs. I'm curious if you have more examples of that, or examples where states have pushed back against China, and how has China responded to that? I mean, again, thinking about the last 70 years of history, we've moved through into a world which is dominated by a US vision of a free and open order. Countries have got used to how to navigate their relationships with the United States. And the US has got used to dealing with allies and partners who don't always agree with it. I'm curious, Andrea, start with you, but then we'll come back to Nadej. How is China responding when there's a bit of pushback? Because this seems to be maybe a new dimension for Beijing to have to deal with. But Adam, let's start with you on the cyberspace question.
So, I mean, I think the Chinese see, if there is going to be a bifurcated internet between a more and less open one, I think they see the open one both as a threat and as an opportunity. Certainly, they are still worried about the flow of information, although I think they can be, given the last 10 years, fairly confident that they have managed to keep, whacking that mole and managed to control the domestic uses of the internet, and have been very successful, unfortunately, in kind of squeezing the space for any public discourse that it's outside of the party's control. I think on the opportunity side, both on the cyber espionage, the influence operations side, and the fact that, Chinese tech has benefited immensely from an open and global system. They see that as still, I think, providing advantages, and China is working to exploit this open system. I think the struggle for the US and others is, how do we make sure that the benefits of the open system still flow to the US and its allies, and limit or at least curtail some of the more nefarious, malicious uses of the internet by potential adversaries? And that is what we are still struggling with. So I think primarily for China, it's an opportunity and not so much a risk these days.
Thank you. Andrea, could we come to you for this question of sort of Chinese overreach and pushback, and how you're seeing that play out in the areas you're studying?
Right. That's a great question. And I do think that we are at a very important moment where things really could shift. There's so much concern about China's overreach, about just the drastic human rights violations, from Hong Kong to, of course, the Uyghurs, to human rights defenders generally in China. And now, of course, there are reports that the Xinjiang sort of internment camps and forced labor kind of program, if you will, is now being instituted in Tibet, just kind of going back to Tibet. So it's Tibet, Xinjiang, Tibet. None of this looks good. It's all dire, and it's encouraging now to see various alliances among states, or maybe alliances is too strong a word, sort of partnerships, coalitions, like the group sort of legislators across the sort of liberal democracies world coming together to try to address challenges from China. I imagine that there is a similar sort of thing that's much more quiet happening at the Human Rights Council as well, among the like-mindeds. So I think that because of, yes, the will for diplomacy, all the sort of COVID stuff, that, people are pissed off, I think, or like they've had it, like enough, and it's time to actually do something. So my concern, though, is that we might miss this very important opportunity, which is unprecedented. The Human Rights Council independent experts saying, come on, government, come on, states, come on, Human Rights Council, you have to address these egregious human rights violations from China. And then the NGOs from all over, 60 different countries were represented in this NGO open letter saying, yes, please, come on, do it, right? So if we don't jump on this opportunity, I fear that we really may well lose. Anyway, yeah, I'm not sure if I really answered your question. I mean, of course, China does exert so much pressure and influence over its partners, BRI partners, other countries that are really cannot afford to offend China or to not do what China says. And so I think it's incumbent upon the United States and the like-mindeds to be much stronger in embracing and defending the current international human rights order, and also sort of saying to these countries, hey, we've got your back, and offer appealing alternatives to what China is offering, or sort of or inflicting, if you will, right? So we need to be more engaged. We need to reestablish. We need to repair our relationships with our allies and really focus on this threat. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to make one final point, which is that we among the liberal democracies absolutely need to be focused on the Beijing Olympics. I fear that if the Olympics, the Winter Olympics of 2022, are held in Beijing, this really could be the end. I mean, the end of the current international human rights order as we know it. It could well be the end of the Olympics, and perhaps the end of a lot of other things. It's really an incredible, but it's also perhaps an opportunity, right, for countries to come together, actually pressure on the IOC, and just say, we have to do something. Beijing absolutely cannot hold these Olympics.
Andre, let me cut you off. Thank you, because
I'm sorry.
You made the point I was going to ask each of you a final question before we wrap up. And that's, as you look out over the next couple of years, what's the example? What's the indicator that you would look for in your area that you've focused on that would be a good test? Andrea, you said for the human rights work, it's the Beijing Olympics 2022. Adam, in the issues you work on, is there something coming up, and what's that time frame where we would sort of get a feel for, are we moving in one direction or another? And then Nadej, stepping back and taking more of a kind of geopolitical perspective, what are the next sort of set of milestones or deadlines that you're looking at that give us an indication of which way the trends that you've been describing in this report are heading? Adam and Nadej, just a couple minutes each, and then I'm going to turn over to Roy to wrap up our session today.
Sure, thanks very much. So actually, Michael, you made the point for me. I think the criteria we're looking for, or the metric we're looking for, would be closing the gap between the US and Europe on privacy and data issues, right? We just had Schrems 2, the court case that undermined the agreement that allows US tech firms to transfer data from Europe to the US. We may have a new working of that, but it's really essential for those to get their a kind of common transatlantic agreement about how we regulate, collect data. So if we were managed to do that in the next, let's say, 2 years, which would be a reach, but if we manage that, then I think we would be in a better position to push back on some of the cyber diplomacy sides.
Well, on my end, I think it's also probably the concluding point here, which is what we have observed for the last 2 years is it's a long project, but at the same time, it's only a snapshot of discussions that are happening now. What we describe is not necessarily a finite vision. It may evolve. I think over and over again, China has proven that it's very flexible in its approach, and that goes back to also maybe this Leninist principle that if you strike mush, you can advance, and if you strike steel, then you need to push. I mean, you need to step back a little. And I think in many areas, China is still feeling the stones, and it doesn't mean either that because they have this vision that is forming, they are going to be successful in realizing it. I mean, both Adam and Andrea mentioned that there's some pushback going on. The way it deals with this pushback is also going to be interesting to follow. What we have seen since the pandemic is also a more aggressive face, a more coercive face from China. Preventing unity and cohesion from its supposed adversaries is also one of the key elements of China's strategy. And how is it going to be able to do that? It's not so much necessarily creating a bloc around China, but at least mitigating and making sure that others do not form that bloc is, I think, probably as important in Beijing's view. So maybe a transient rather than permanent vision, and just keep in mind that this is something that it's in progress. They're thinking about it, and it might evolve in different direction in the future, based on China's material power, based on the progress it will have made in Belt and Road countries, etc. So we're still in the process of seeing this world view emerge.
Thank you all. Andrea, Adam, Nadej, thank you for the presentations, remarks, and responses to questions. Thank you all for watching. We're going to turn this back to Roy Camphausen to make a couple of closing remarks here.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks to our panelists, thanks to our audience. What a great group. More than 220 folks on the line. For our audience, the video and audio recording of this event will be available on the NBR website a little bit later today. Let me add a couple of thoughts about conclusions and maybe even policy implications. First is, as Nadej noted, it's really the collision, if you will, of the classical Tianxia tributary system of structure and China's current Leninist political system in the development of China's international vision, which is a key contribution of this study. As Nadej noted, although Chinese elites have turned to the traditional Tianxia model to help shape China's vision, the vision ultimately relies on Leninist ideals of power, domination, and the pursuit of clear objectives. And we've explored that throughout our time today. This notion of a loose, partial, and malleable hegemony is one that we hope you'll continue to grapple with. This approach does challenge in many ways the existing US-led liberal international order. But as was discussed, the project finds that China's vision is still very much in its early stages, meaning the US still has agency to shape, redirect, deter even Chinese efforts in ways that are conducive to American interests. Nadej provides several recommendations for US leaders to effectively respond to China's vision. Let me share a couple. First, the developing non-Western, non-democratic world needs to be a priority for American focus. Second, existing international institutions are areas where the US competition will take place and thus are worthy from greater attention from American policymakers. It's also important to highlight the differences between the kind of international leadership that this China vision might result in. The US should expand opportunities to partner with non-allies by seeking to cooperate in ways that actually strengthen democracy and responding to the real challenges that they face. terms of natural disasters, protecting human rights, preventing economic crises, and so forth. The findings of the project indicate that China's expansion is not predicated primarily on the use of military power. And I find this interesting as a student of China's PLA for many years, but on other instruments of national power, particularly economic statecraft, and a drive to shape the external environment through discourse power, which is explored in this study, as well as influence operations. This really underscores a key recommendation, which is that our country and our system needs to renew emphasis on studying contemporary China in the original language, seeing how the Chinese speak about their aspirations for and vision for a new world order in Chinese. And this is an important priority. This project has provided remarkable insights into how Chinese elites imagine China's role in its own vision for a future world global order. The contours are still a bit blurry, and while it's beginning to take shape, the U.S. really needs to act now to proactively influence, shape, and even deter China's vision. Thank you all for coming today, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Take care.